Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Concise History of Western Music, presented by Dr. Harold Rosenbaum. Harold, who happens to be a local resident, is the award-winning founder and conductor of the New York Virtuoso Singers and is currently the music director at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Katona. He has taught at Juilliard, Queens College, and Adelphi University. Tonight's program is based on a course Harold taught at these universities, where he discusses the evolution of classical music from the medieval period through today. Welcome, Harold.
I'm actually going to start from biblical times, and I'm going to not spend too much time on each period because we only have about an hour to squeeze in 2,000 years of music. But here we go. And obviously I can't cover everything, but in Psalm 150 has in it, praise him with the sound of the trumpet, with the harp and the lyre. A lyre is a U-shaped harp instrument. The timbrel, which is a tambourine, praise him with the timbrel, praise him with strings and pipe and cymbals. All of that's mentioned in one psalm. So obviously, there was a lot of music making back then. I would say if you see movies like, I don't know, Spartacus or some of the movies that take place in ancient Rome, and you have these trumpeters all playing chords, like modern day chord progressions. I mean, that's not accurate. We don't think that's accurate at all. Where else do we know about ancient instruments and ancient music making? Pictures, vases. Ancient Greece, you have a lot of caves, you have a lot of paintings and images, and even some writings about music. But let's go all the way now to the Middle Ages, or even sort of before that. Well, let's start from the beginning of the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages, you might say, is like 800 to something like that to 1450, and the music back then, still at the beginning of the medieval period, was very much like ancient music in that you basically heard only one melody at a time. It was just a melody. There was a misconception later on, and I'll get to that, that there was a melody accompanied by chords like this. If I had a hammer, where you strum on guitar and you sing the melody, because there were pictures of these instruments and people thought it was just that, melody and accompanied by harmony, but it really wasn't. We know now that somebody would sing a melody, let's say, and a string player would also play the same melody and sort of doubling it. Mostly, there might be slight variations where you might have somebody singing like ah, 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 and the instrumentalist might go like a little additional note, and that's called heterophony. But you don't have to worry about that. But there are three styles of music I'd like you to either write down or just try to remember, because throughout the history of music, one style predominated. And when I say style, I don't mean folk music or pop music. Those are different, types of music. But we are talking about classical music here. So I would say the styles are monophonic, mono meaning one. I'll go back to that in a minute. Homophonic, Homophonic, which is melody supported by chords, and polyphonic, Poly, which is two or more melodies or melodic fragments at the same time. And the periods of history are really defined by and categorized by either one or the other. I mean, mainly, it's not all throughout. But in other words, let me turn my phone off. Okay, and also the sun is going down, so you'll have less glare. I can actually do this and you'll see me better in about 2 minutes when the sun goes down. The medieval period is monophonic because it's one melody at a given time. And the most obvious example of that is something that you most likely have heard of, which is Gregorian chant, where Pope Gregory codified all the single line sacred chants. And there were actually secular chants too, but we don't have time to get into that. But something like Ave Maria. So that's Gregorian chant. It's a single line. There is no harmony. There's no concept of harmony. And when I say harmony, I mean, I'm going to supply right now harmony to that chant. They would never have heard this, but Ave Maria. They just didn't think like that. Now, fast forward, you have, let's say in the 1200s and 1300s, you had some famous, then famous and still famous composers in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which of course was, damaged by fire dramatically and won't be back in action for a while. And coincidentally, I had a dream the night before the fire that I was in Paris, and I said to my daughter, look at Notre Dame, and it wasn't there. It was, and then the next day there was a fire, but that's neither here or there. Anyway, in Notre Dame is where actually polyphony, which is two or more melodies at the same time, started to develop. And there were organists there. And, throughout history, organists were required to compose, like Bach. Bach wasn't known as a composer. He was known as an organist who, as part of his job, had to compose. It's unbelievable. I'm talking about Landini and what was the other one? Landini and I forget, Perotin, P-E-R-O-T-I-N, Perotin. These were great organists who started to sort of elaborate Gregorian chant. They changed it a bit. And we think how that happened was this. Imagine the priest going, Ave Ma, and then the congregation responds. And so you have everybody singing along, but you have some people singing out of tune. So instead of Ave, you might have a whole bunch of people going Ave, and it sounds to me like Oy vey, but that's another story completely. Ave Maria, very strange sounding, but they liked it. These organists / composers liked that sound, and they started getting an idea that maybe they can have Gregorian chant on one line as it was, and a second line would not only be parallel to that line. In this case, I was singing a fifth higher. Here's the A. I was going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I was going out of tune. But he started to like that, and he started writing things like this. Here's the actual chant, and the top part. See, it starts to have a little ornamental quality to it. And that's, if I can remember, I'm not a trained musicologist, but let me think. That's called, I forget I forget the name of the type of piece organum. It's called organum. And then they started realizing, okay, let's elaborate on that. And they started doing like, instead of just the chant, which became now elongated so that each note is very long, and above it, you have two parts like this. And you have 3-part writing, and 2 of them are very active, and the third one is the chant, organum. Wonderful, wonderful. New music, It took hundreds of years to develop. Now we get to the medieval, the end of the medieval period. You have a composer called Guillaume Dufay, William D-U-F-A-Y, the transitional figure between medieval and Renaissance. And he was the first to write a 4-part mass. a four-part mass, the setting, the liturgical setting of the Roman Catholic Church. And in his mass, he has, one part which is elongated and all the other parts spin around it. Now that's the development, what I just described as a development of polyphony, two or more melodies or melodic fragments at the same time. I mean, a good modern example is a round like row, row, row your boat. So row, 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 row your boat, it starts off, everybody sings the same melody. So that's monophonic because they're singing one melody in unison. And then when they get to the second person goes, so then the third person comes in. So you have polyphony. Another word for polyphony is counterpoint, but don't worry about that. So you have, so far, the medieval period, the basic chant is monophonic music, and then polyphonic music. Okay, the thing about Dufay is really interesting that he actually took a popular tune. He was very defiant and very clever. He took a piece that it was a popular song called "If My Face Be Pale, It's Because I'm in Love." If my face be pallid, pallid, no, the cause is love. And he stretched each note out. If my, and he set the words Kyrie eleison, which is Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, which is the first movement of the Mass. And he puts all the other parts around it singing Kyrie eleison. And he was probably standing in back of the church laughing because here is a secular piece all about love stuck in during the church service. Okay, now we move on to what the development of polyphony, the great masters of polyphony. I can name probably at least 30 or 40 great Renaissance composers, because now we're into the Renaissance period. 1450 to 1600 is the Renaissance period. And you have, of course, a Palestrina. Most of you have probably heard of Palestrina. John Dowland, Orlando Gibbons. The best one, I think, is Josquin de Prez, Josquin, and then new word D-E-S, and then P-R-E-Z or P-R-E-S, depending. Everybody then and now considers him the best composer before Bach. His years were 1450 probably to definitely 1521. And his music is absolutely stunningly beautiful and perfect. So is Palestrina, so is Gibbons. There are so many great, great composers of the Renaissance. But here's the deal. If you think of it, in Renaissance music, where you have four different melodies at the same time and four different texts. I mean, it's the same text, but at any given time, you would have different syllables of different words, coinciding and clashing. So what happened was the Pope at that time, in the late 16th century, went to John. I'm calling him John. His name is Giovanni. You all know who I mean. It's Palestrina. Giovanni da D.A. Palestrina. So why do we know him as Palestrina when he really was John of the town of Palestrina? But we think of him as Palestrina. And he was writing 8-part music. In fact, there was one composer, now that I think of it, in the Renaissance, Thomas Tallis, one of the greats, who wrote a piece for 40 voices, 40 different melodies simultaneously. I heard the piece. I don't like it very much. It's like a trick. I don't happen to like it, but that's just me. I actually heard it in a performance in England and a few other times. Yeah, it went nuts. They went nuts towards the end of the Renaissance. Not everybody, but it was very common to have 4-part music, but you had people like Palestrina writing like 8-part music, and the Pope summoned him and said, cut it out. The congregation can't understand the words. Simplify it. Simplify your music. Well, he wasn't about to do that, but other people started doing it. I'll get to that in a moment. What happened was word caught on that the Pope was not happy with all this, intermingling, all these intermingling lines. Like think of row, row, row your boat. You can imagine that. You don't have the word row when all three parts are in, or all four parts are in. You have four different words at any given moment. And the Pope said, no, this is not going to work for me. So a group of noblemen and the patrons and, the rich class, they got together in Florence. And this was the last decade of the 16th century, and they called themselves the kamurata. And they decided they were going to dictate and mandate what type of writing composers were going to have to do from then on. Keep in mind, you didn't have concert halls, you didn't have public concerts, you had every composer was bound to I'll say his because 99.9% of composers were men, were bound to their employer. Every municipality had a duke and a band, instrumental ensemble. Let's call it a consort. In those days, they didn't call them orchestras; they were consorts. Let me just take a swig of water a minute. Sorry. Consorts were between 5 and 15 instruments, and a typical consort would have, these were early instruments. You didn't have the trumpets with valves; they were valveless. But you had sackbut. I won't define these because there's no time. But sackbuts, viola da gambas, cornetto, and things like that. So it wasn't a mighty noise; it was a subdued noise. But anyway, they said to the composers, "We want you to do what the ancients did," and they misinterpreted, as I said before, what the ancients did by looking at pictures of instruments accompanying singers. And they thought the ancients did chords accompanying melodies, But so they told them they want to write simple melody with, a chordal accompaniment. This is around the year 1600. And that was the birth of opera. And the opera has, let's say one singer and a small orchestra. And the first great opera was in 1607, Monteverdi. It was Orfeo. It was either Orfeo or the Coronation of Poppea. Those are his two great operas. I think it was Orfeo first, because before Monteverdi, who was the first giant of the Renaissance, of the Baroque. Wait a minute, let me think. 1600, right? So this is now the. Let me think, 1450 to 1600, 1600 to 1750 is the Baroque period. This is the first, right. So, they didn't wake up one day and say, oh, now we're in the Baroque period. But anyway, this was the beginning of the, Baroque period. And the Baroque period with a capital B goes from 1600 to 1750. So in 1607, the first great opera came. But before that, in 1603 and 1605, you had meandering lines and accompaniment, but they weren't very good. But Monteverdi was a great composer and added a lot of drama, a lot of dissonance, and he was the first opera composer. And then it took off. So in the Baroque period, you had mostly this homophonic style. Homophonic meaning one melody accompanied by chords. I can demonstrate. I did already with If I Had a Hammer, but even, as I said before, the Baroque period wasn't just homophonic, and the classical period was not just this or that. It was a mixture. So I can play something homophonic that you will recognize. Playing chords, but the top note of the chord, because it's on top, stands out. You hear it more simply because it's on top. And there's a church hymn. All church hymns are homophonic, right? My piano hasn't been tuned since the pandemic, so forgive me. are all homophonic. That's what hymns are. So it started like that, but then, you'd had people like Handel. These are the great, okay, who are the great Baroque composers? Well, let's mention Purcell. I don't want to forget to mention Henry Purcell. In fact, he was the first great English opera composer. So Monteverdi at the beginning, and Purcell later on in the mid 17th century, but then the two giants, Handel and Bach. And Handel, I can demonstrate all three styles in one piece of Handel. But what I want to say is that towards the latter part of the of the Baroque period, that's when Handel, was writing, and also Bach. Polyphony dominated, especially with Bach. Handel was a mixture of homophonic and polyphonic. I'll demonstrate. And by the way, they were both born in 1685. Bach died in 1750 and Handel died in 1759. They had the same eye doctor, but they never met. I'm serious. So here's something you all know, right? That's homophonic. The melody's on top, but at the same time I'm playing the melody, I'm playing block chords underneath it, supporting the melody. But there's no independent rhythmic activity in the left hand. And it's not like, but even that would be homophonic, because it's basically melody on top and chords underneath. But then, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth, where everybody sings the same note at the same time with the same rhythm, and the orchestra even doubles the voices. That's monophonic. That's a throwback to the medieval period. But then, the sopranos go, for the Lord, and while they're holding the word for before they take off on higher notes, the tenors come in like this. See, they sing hallelujah, hallelujah. So you have these two different melodies at the same time. And then Handel supplies 3 and 4 different lines at the same time. So it's a mixture with Handel. With Bach, it's no longer a mixture. Bach's music is like 99% polyphonic. I'm going to play the opening of a cantata by Bach. It starts with the alto, then the tenor comes in. When each part comes in, I'll highlight their part. You'll see, I'll play them louder. But keep in mind, when each part comes in, the original part continues. So it's one part, it becomes 2 parts, then the sopranos come in, and right after the sopranos, the basses come in. 4 different melodies at the same time. Page turn, so far there were only 2 parts, and suddenly the soprano joins in, then the basses. It's very active. And if you notice, the inner parts have their own rhythmic life, and there are really 4 melodies at the same time. Okay, so that's Bach. Bach died in 1750. He had 20 children. Half of them died. Another 5 or 6 of them were good composers, some better than others. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach was the best of them. And they called their father's music despicable pieces of pedantry because the style was changing. I mean, I'm sure when bell bottoms came out in the 60s, their parents called those despicable pieces of cloth. I don't know. But anyway, the sons actually sold a stack of manuscript of cantatas that he wrote. Bach wrote cantatas and had them in a pile on the piano. It was after a certain war that happened. They were short of paper and they sold them to the fish market to wrap fish in. So, yeah. So we have, about 100 cantatas lost. I mean, this man, it's been estimated that if an adult spent 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, just copying over Bach's music, it would take 45 years. So it just flowed out of him. It flowed out of him. It flowed out of Mozart. It did not flow out of Beethoven. But, you know, every composer is different. Okay, just pick up pieces of pedantry. Well, okay, now we're in the classical period. The great composers of the classical period, obviously Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. They sort of all knew each other. Almost all of them sort of, they intermingled. I mean, off the top of my head, Mozart, well, Haydn was born first. He was born in 1739 and died in 1732 and died in 1809. So he lived, you know, to be like 79 or 80, something like that. They called him Papa Haydn. Well, Mozart comes along in 1756, and Haydn knew that he was a great genius. Mozart died at 35 or 36 years old in 1791. Beethoven was born in 1770. So during Mozart's time, Beethoven and died in 1827, at which point the classical period ended, and you had the Romantic period, which we'll talk about in 5 minutes. But Haydn invented the symphony. He invented the symphonic form. There were no symphonies before Haydn. Now, keep in mind, still, this was still the patronage system. Haydn worked for decades, I think at least 30 years, for Prince Esterhazy in Eisenstadt. Eisenach? Eisenstadt, I keep forgetting. Eisenach, I think, is where Bach was born, in Eisenstadt, where I was. I visited there, is where it's an hour outside of Vienna, and Haydn worked for Prince Esterhazy and went to him once a week and said, "Oh, Prince, what would you have me write for your dinner and your assembly after the dinner?" And he would tell him, "I want a symphony, or I want a march, or whatever." And he would comply. And he had to wear servants' outfits. And really, he had to wear a servant, outfit. So it was demeaning. On the other hand, he was actually working with the best orchestra in Europe, which played all of his music. I mean, how many composers do you know living today or ever who had the luxury of having every single piece you wrote played by the best orchestra in Europe in the hall, which had the best acoustics? I had the great honor to go there at the Esterhazy Palace, and it was roped off so you couldn't get onto the stage where Haydn conducted. But I pleaded with the officials, told them who I was, and they let me up there. So I stood in the exact spot where Haydn was. Now I say conducted, but that's a whole other lecture where, you know, people didn't really conduct with batons or actually stand there and conduct until the mid-19th century. So at that time, like Mozart, for example, would lead performances from the keyboard or from the violin. One composer, Lully, a French Baroque composer, way back now in the Baroque period, he had a big stick. He would pound the floor to keep the beat. The problem was he hit his foot, he got gangrene, and he died. And not during the piece. I mean, it was over a period of time. So they figured maybe a little baton would be better, you know? Okay, so now we're talking about, so Haydn studied with Beethoven, but Beethoven was, not really interested. No, wait, Haydn, no. Beethoven studied with Haydn, took a few lessons. Haydn was too busy to really take a good look. Haydn was very much, the establishment. He wrote music to please. Haydn's a great composer, but he's no Mozart. So Haydn's whole life was writing on commission. Mozart, half and half. I mean, Mozart got commissioned, but he also got commissions, but he also wrote, things that he just needed to write that, that he didn't know if he'd be paid for it. He was not as successful as Haydn. Obviously, he died in poverty. It's a long story. You all know the story where he got a knock on his door when he was very, very ill. And it was the servant of a count in town, Count von Walsegg, who commissioned Mozart to write a requiem for his wife for requiem service. And Mozart thought that the man coming to him, because Mozart was pretty delirious at that time, was asking him to write his own requiem, which never finished. People think that's the last piece he wrote. It's the last incomplete piece he wrote. The last piece he wrote was Ave Verum Corpus. People say, he was buried in a pauper's grave. We don't know where he was buried, but actually I visited his grave. I visited the grave of a lot of composers, including Beethoven and Bach. But Mozart is buried in St. Mark's Cemetery, near 10 minutes closer to Vienna than the central cemetery outside of Vienna, where Brahms, Schubert, Beethoven, Schoenberg, and others, including Mahler, until recently, they removed him, are all buried in the same place, the same little cul-de-sac. But Mozart is all by himself in a field with a statue of an angel with a torch turned upside down and plunged into the ground as if his life was snuffed out. Okay, but Beethoven fought the patronage system. He was a maniac. I mean, he was a tortured soul, and Haydn wanted him to stick with tradition, and Beethoven would have none of it. And I'll give you some examples of innovations that Beethoven came up with. These are okay. So the right, that's in C minor. It's in C minor. Up until that time, the first movement of every sonata, whatever key it was in, the last movement would be in the same key. If the first movement were in, G minor, like Mozart's 40th Symphony, his last movement is also in G minor. But Beethoven, if you remember, if you notice, Beethoven's last movement is like he's saying, triumph, like, good triumphs over evil, because minor is associated with sadness, and major, happiness and optimism. He also connected the third movement to the fourth. I actually connected it with no pause. He also put, he had two themes. No, he had three themes in the first movement. That's unheard of. It's always two themes. I mean, this is sonata allegro form, which all classical composers adhere to. It's a great, great form. I love it. Theme one is in a key, and theme two is in the dominant of the dominant key. So if this was standard, so if a symphony opened in C major, the second theme would be in G major, something like that. Then there's a development section, and then there's a recapitulation. It was a form. Beethoven broke the rules all over the place. He had trombones and piccolos in the orchestra. That was the first time in the history of music that trombones were used in an orchestra, and piccolos also. I can go on and on about the innovations of Beethoven, and he got his way. I mean, everybody was, sort of bowed down. I mean, Haydn bowed down to the prince, but the prince bowed down to Beethoven. He didn't die a wealthy man, but he was, he was extraordinarily successful. Too bad he was deaf the second part of his life, completely deaf. Okay, so Beethoven dies in 1827, and the Romantic period sprung forth. Schubert, we think of as a Romantic composer, a composer from the Romantic period. And I can give you some characteristics of the Romantic period. If I had more time, I would compare the Romantic music with Romantic paintings like, Delacroix and Peter Paul Rubens and all these great masters using a lot of color, because in the 19th century, the orchestra got expanded even more. I don't have time to, but in the Baroque period, the orchestra was larger than the Renaissance, and in the Classical period, the orchestra was again larger, and more modern instruments started to emerge. in the Romantic period, the orchestra went from 45 maximum during Beethoven's time to 60, 70, 80 players. And so the 19th century was a century of ego, composers putting their ego into the music. Like, notice how I sort of skipped over Bach very quickly. To me, Bach is, God. I mean, he's like my favorite composer by far. I didn't talk much about him, but I'll plug something. Starting in January 2022, I'm conducting 21 concerts in a row of Bach's music, 6 of them in Katona at my church where I'm the organist, St. Luke's, Katona. So if you want to email me at haroldrosenbaum@gmail.com, I can put you on my mailing list and you'll know when those happen. So now we are in the Romantic period. And when I say composers put their egos in, I mean, Haydn would never do that, and Mozart would never. And I'll tell you, you'll see what I mean in a moment. They stuck with the forms, the sonata, piano sonatas. They stuck with the forms. But here comes Hector Berlioz. And he was a tortured soul also because his mother cursed him and said, she'll never speak to him again because she wanted him to be a doctor like his father. He was French. What are his dates? I don't know, 1810 or 20, or so. It's the beginning of the Romantic period. But he tried to study. He was studying medicine in Paris, and what happened was he went into the dissecting room. There was no air conditioning, so the windows are open, and if you don't want to be grossed out, close your eyes and ears. But the crows began flying in, and there was a corpse, and he just jumped out the window. He couldn't take it, and he decided to be a musician. So his mother cursed him, and he felt that curse. So we all know most of you probably know his famous Symphonie Fantastique. He called it Symphonie Fantastique. What does that mean in English? The Fantastic Symphony. Before his time and before the 19th century, composers didn't label things like that. I mean, you have Beethoven, a Passionata, and the Waldstein Sonata, and the Hammerklavier Sonata. But these, first of all, types of titles that I just mentioned by Beethoven and others were not really given by them anyway. It's the publisher. The Moonlight Sonata, the publishers came up with those. But notice they're not personal. They're not like Symphonie Fantastique, like the Fantastic Symphony. But it goes beyond that. A new form developed. Now, can I think of the name of it? It's been so many years since I've taught this, but it wasn't a symphony. I forget the name of it. You can look it up. But it was a symphonic work, symphonic in nature, meaning the instruments, orchestra. A tone poem. There it is. It's a tone poem. A tone poem is a symphonic work, which means, an orchestra plays it, but the movements have titles. And Beethoven hinted at that, with his 7th symphony. No, it was the 6th, which is 6th or 7th, and also Vivaldi, the Seasons. And one of Beethoven's symphonies is all about nature. I think it's the 6th symphony. I forget it. Anyway, they just hinted at it, but it just exploded in the 19th century. And a tone poem would actually have a story behind it. The opposite of tone poem is absolute music. So all of Mozart's symphonies and all of even Brahms' symphonies later on are absolute music, meaning there's no story behind it. You just close your eyes and listen. You're not supposed to associate the notes with the story. But here's the story in Symphonie Fantastique, which you read about. If you go to a concert hall, you'll be given a program, a printed program, and Berlioz wanted you to know what he was doing. And the story was a young man fell in love with an actress, and she didn't fall in love with him. She ignored him, and so he took opium to ease the pain. And the first movement, is labeled, I forget the name of it, but I do remember there's one movement, all 5 movements have titles, and one movement is At the Ball. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, the dancing of waltz at the ball. And later on, you hear this theme that I didn't mention to you, which goes like this. The theme is supposed to be his loved one who thwarted him. Here's the melody that we're supposed to associate with the woman he fell in love with. In real life, it was Harriet Smithson, who was an Irish actress. And this is the melody he has in all 5 movements in different forms. It goes on and on. It just goes on and on. It's the longest melody. This is the age, as I said, with the ego and the increased orchestras and everything becomes bigger, and also the flourishing of melody. Now in the 19th century, we're back in where we were at the beginning of the Baroque, at the beginning of the classical period, which is homophonic. Homophonic is melody accompanied by chords. I'm going to play for you some of the famous melodies. You probably know every single one. Right? You know that. How about Tchaikovsky, Romeo and Juliet? You ever, in the olden days, I used to watch TV and there was a commercial. You can buy LPs or CDs or whatever it was, cassettes, the greatest melodies of all time. Well, they were all written during the, every one of the 30 or 50 melodies in the set that you'd be buying was from the Romantic period. Mendelssohn. How about Liszt, the Liebesträume by Franz Liszt? As opposed to Bach, Bach is not known for melodies that you walk out humming. I mean, here's one particular, I'm going to play 2 melodies by Bach, the extremes. This is literally a melody in one of his fugues. That's it. And then he builds on it. At the other extreme is one of his Brandenburg concertos. It's not like the melodies I just played, which you can really walk out humming. Here's one. You'd probably know this. It just goes on and on. It's instrumentally conceived. It's not written for the voice. And I mean, in this particular one, it's not written for singers, but even most of his choral works, singers sort of struggle with the melodies, which aren't really, he didn't think of the human voice as an entity which can put forth memorable melodies. It just wasn't the concept. They were thinking more of counterpoint and putting melodies together. That's not to say Bach didn't write beautiful melodies. I mean, here on a G string, he wrote gorgeous melodies. There are exceptions to all rules. Anyway, the Romantic period. I'm keeping aware of the time here because we only have like 16 minutes. Before I take your questions, if you have any, the Romantic period had such giants, obviously, as Chopin and, oh, I mentioned Schubert. Now, Schubert, just going back for a minute, you know, lived in Vienna, and he would go into the same tavern or cafe where Beethoven would go daily. He, you know, keep in mind, Beethoven was born in 1770 and Schubert was born in 1798. So he was 28 years his junior, and Beethoven was very famous, and Schubert was very young and very shy. he'd look at Beethoven every day. He'd sit in a corner drinking his whatever, and they never met. Schubert's another tragic figure. When he was 17, when he was 18, when he was 19, he wrote an average of 150 works a year, including 5 songs in one day. And the music really just poured out of him. He wrote 5 songs in one day. When I say songs, an art song is what I'm referring to. An art song is, a song that a classical composer composes, which has not only a melody, but the accompaniment, written out. It's not simple chords like a chart, like when you go to play bar mitzvahs or weddings, you have a chart of chords, and you can it just has like G, M, which means G major, and you just play the chord. No, this was all written out beautifully. Okay, so now we're back in the Romantic period, the mid-19th century. You have Brahms, who looked back as opposed to composers who looked ahead. So Brahms used the forms that the classical composers used. He wrote symphonies in sonata form and theme and variations, and he was a giant. But he was looking back. Who are the ones who looked ahead? Well, Chopin, nobody ever heard anything like Chopin's piano music. And by the way, Chopin never had a piano lesson in his life. Or I should say he had some piano lessons, but they were given by a violin player. So he was self-taught. Some of the great Romantic composers, oh my God, Schumann, Robert Schumann. By the way, Robert Schumann's piano is in Westchester County, a friend of mine's house. Brahms played on it. Oh my God. Richard Strauss. There were 2 Strausses, Johann, the March King, and Richard Strauss is, very late 19th century, I guess, early to mid 20th century. But I don't consider him a really great composer. He has his moments. Some of the other great composers in the Romantic period, you can help me here. Franz Liszt came up with some really good ones. And who else? Name some, anybody can jump in. In the meantime, I'll go to the end of the 19th century, when you had pointillism in painting and impressionism, and you had composers who were in that league, in that ilk, in that frame of mind, like Debussy and Ravel later on, at the same time, but Ravel lived beyond Debussy, I believe, quite a bit more. By the way, the world's leading scholar on Maurice Ravel is Dr. R.B. Orenstein, my former teacher at Queens College 53 years ago, who lives on Long Island. And he actually possesses a lot of Ravel's memorabilia, like a paperweight from Ravel's house. He has like 60 of those. Anyway, and let's not forget Wagner, late 19th century. Everybody was stunned by Wagner, his music. But technically, let me just say this. Oh, Prokofiev, thank you, Ted. Of course. Great composer. Tchaikovsky, of course. Oh, did I mention Tchaikovsky when I mentioned Romeo and Juliet? Yeah. Okay. These are great composers. Rachmaninoff, I visited Rachmaninoff's grave last week. He's buried in Kensico Cemetery in Westchester County. Yep. As is Danny Kaye, Beverly Sills, Robert Merrill, and Lou Gehrig. I know for a fact. Okay, but here's the thing about the late 19th century. There was a huge transition away from tonality. What is tonality? Tonality means it's in a key, and there's one note that's the main note in that key. So every piece from the Renaissance, let's forget the medieval period, that was not tonal, it was modal. That's a whole other story. not enough time. Every piece probably pop music, classical music, whatever, probably ends in these two chords. Happy birthday, dear daughter, happy birthday to you. Row, row, you boat. No, not row, row your boat, not around, because that's a whole other story. But anyway, Wagner would do this. Oh my God, what is that? It's a dissonance. It's an augmented chord. So he stretched tonality. That's what these composers started doing. They stretched tonality. So you wonder, what key are we in? Because, the thing is, there are people today some people, not many, I know a few people who like to write in Mozart's style, or old style, but, it's all been said already. It's all been said. So by the end of the 19th century, they were looking for something new. And Wagner came along. He was the biggest giant of a composer, most famous. King Ludwig of Bavaria built an opera house for him, because no opera house existing could handle his ring cycle or some of the great operas he wrote. So tonality started being stretched, and then you had Debussy with using, instead of the major minor scales, like started using something called the whole tone scale. You've all heard the whole tone scale, because when you see a dream sequence in a movie and it starts getting hazy, you hear, and major seventh chords. The whole language changed. Like jazz is completely different from classical. The language, until Schoenberg came along, and he wanted to emancipate the dissonance. That's what he said. I want to emancipate the dissonance. Now, what does that mean? Up until 1912 or so, this would always resolve to that. Dissonance, consonant. The interplay of dissonance and consonance throughout the history of music, it was always there, but there was more dissonance as we get closer to the modern times. The closer we get, the more dissonance there is and was, until 1921. 1912, when Schoenberg started writing atonal music, not tonal, atonal, the lack of a tonal center. I'm going to actually play for you the ending of what I consider a great piece. It's called De Profundis. Out of the depths I cry unto thee, in Psalm 130, I think. And this is the actual ending. It's a choral piece, a cappella choral piece. I'm going to play it on the piano. Now, if you ate dinner a few minutes ago, I'm hoping that'll stay in your stomach for a while. Yeah, it's not easy listening. I love it. My brain is wired to love that stuff for some reason. And then he had two students, Berg and Webern, who followed suit, and they wrote atonal music. The great operas, Lulu by Berg, and what's the other great opera by Berg? Lulu and it'll come to me in a minute. I heard both of them during the pandemic. They're very, 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 very dissonant. Dissonance doesn't resolve to consonance anymore. A piece can end like that. The whole piece is dissonant. The whole piece is atonal, lack of a key. We only have like 4 minutes, but I'll just keep going. We're sort of almost there. After Schoenberg and Webern and Berg, most of the great composers all over the world tried their hand at writing atonal music. You had Stravinsky, who hated atonal music. He hated it. Even though Stravinsky's music is dissonant, here's a passage from The Rite of Spring. The Sacre du Printemps of Stravinsky. Literally, this is how it goes. It's the E major chord simultaneously with E flat major. Separately, together. So Stravinsky was dissonant, but he wasn't atonal. His pieces always ended on a major chord, you know, basically, until the day Schoenberg died, and then suddenly Stravinsky tried atonal music and became the world's leading composer of atonal music. You couldn't get a university composition position in the 50s and 60s if you weren't writing atonal music, but certain composers refused to do it, like Ned Rorem and Leonard Bernstein, and so many of the composers who just refused. They had their own style, and it worked out for them because you know, after this period of writing atonal music subsided, I mean, people are still doing it, but it pretty much subsided. Now suddenly those people who refused to do it are back in vogue. I've received, without exaggeration, I've received over 12,500 unpublished choral works from composers over the last 45 years or so, and very few of them were atonal. So then we're at the present time where anything goes. I'm seeing new music all the time, and they go from, you know, rather simple to, you know, very dissonant. So who are the great living composers? Oh my God, there's so many. People say, are there any Mozarts around? Well, you know, probably not, but Stravinsky was probably the greatest composer of the 20th century. There's Benjamin Britten, of course. Benjamin Britten wrote a piece, and it was confiscated when he went from New York back to England. They thought it might be some kind of secret code. It was during World War II, so he just wrote it. He wrote it over. He had the whole thing in his head. Great composers today: John Harbison. I mean, I can name so many. John Corigliano, Thea Musgrave, dear friend of mine. She's 92. At 91, she wrote a trumpet concerto, which got a major award. And there are hundreds of great composers living, and I'm so happy when I see a young composer, I mean, really young, writing profound music and going on that path. Okay, time for questions. I don't mind. I mean, and maybe some of you wrote them down. Hi, Liz. There's Liz. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question, and then you had just mentioned Thea, because you know, back in the beginning, you said, well, the majority of the composers were men, and I couldn't think of one even who was female. So what is the percentage? Do you know?
Now, I would say 50-50 now.
Really?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, back then, you know, one of the medieval composers, Hildegard de Bingen or something, like, you know, she was a well-known composer. But look, Clara Schumann was a very gifted composer, but her husband Robert was the star. How about Felix Mendelssohn? His younger sister was considered to be a better composer than him, and she was she was discouraged from composing. But you know, this all changed. Ellen Tafe Swillig, the first woman to get a doctorate in composition from Juilliard. She's about 82 now. I just interviewed her, and she said she was composing since she was 10. You know, they were discouraged. Thea was discouraged, Thea Musgrave, you know, even in the 60s, but now, forget it. Great women composers galore. It's about time. Yeah. Any other questions?
If anyone has questions, they can either put it in the chat or they can unmute themselves.
Yes. Anybody want to show me your face? You're hiding behind a flash through a microphone or a video. All right. Philip Glass. Okay. What about Philip Glass? You know, I met him. It's not one of my favorites. I have a funny story, which was I was driving to my church job, and a symphony by Philip Glass came on the radio, and it was just like, ta! It was one note, and then the clarinets played it, and then the oboe played it, and then the violin played. I just turned it off, and 3 minutes later I turned it on. It was the same D, and then 8 minutes later I turned it same. Okay, I'm not really exaggerating as that happened. I mean, his music is not all like that. But yeah, that's minimal music, minimalistic music. And it's a whole movement I didn't have time to discuss. But I think Steve Reich is a better composer than Philip Glass. Philip Glass is a wonderful man. He's helped composers, young composers, and he's very famous, and his operas have been very successful. David Lang is probably the most successful minimalistic composer now, and a wonderful man. Yeah, that whole John. Well, I should say John Adams. I mean, John Adams is probably um, actually more successful. He's been around longer than David Lang. John Adams is, I think, the most performed American composer, and he did Nixon in China and The Death of Klinghoffer, those two operas, which my chorus was hired to perform in at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. I'm sorry, somebody just shot a question about if you want to receive about my Bach concerts. What I'm doing is, over the course of 2 seasons, and both my New York City choirs, my professional New York Virtuoso Singers and my really, really good amateur Canticum Novum Singers, we're performing all choral movements from all of Bach's 186 choral cantatas in 15 different concerts in New York City, 6 of which we'll do here in Katona 6 days before the presentation on Saturday evening in New York. So if you want to learn about them, just send an email to me. I'll put you on my mailing list, haroldrosenbaum@gmail.com. I mean, I've left out obviously more than I've talked about tonight. How can you do a history of Western music in an hour? Will you give more of these Zoom talks about music and composers? Very interesting. Thank you, Susan. Well, during the pandemic, what I've been doing besides writing a little book and for composers and interviewing 20 conductors, very famous people like Leonard Slatkin, Joanne Falletta, and we're putting one out on YouTube every other week. So there are now 6 of them. It's called The Choral Connection. If you go on YouTube and type The Choral Connection, they're pretty much towards the top. In addition to that, I've given weekly free lectures and workshops every Tuesday night. So I only have 2 left because I started it in early September. If you go to nyvirtuoso.org, nyvirtuoso.org, it'll pop right up. You can sign up for the next one, which is Tuesday at 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock? Yeah. And what the subject will be is how to work with pianists, orchestras, and professional singers. Because in my experience, I've worked with hundreds of pianists, orchestras, and professional singers. So I give my little take on it. And I did write a book called A Practical Guide to Choral Conducting that you can buy on Amazon. It's not that expensive, and it's got an anthology in there with my markings in it. It's basically for conductors, but I think singers will enjoy it and music lovers would enjoy it.
Have you ever tried your hand at composing?
Yeah, I wrote a pop song in 1976. It took me all summer to write this 3-minute piece, and I just poured out my soul. I was devastated. So since then, I mean, I've composed a few things. I've had a few things published by Shermers and Theodore Presser, but no, I'm not really a composer. I'm an interpreter, and I just love seeing a piece of music, hearing it in my head, interpreting it, rehearsing it, performing it. Renee, you had a question?
I did. You said Bach is your favorite composer. And my question is, what was the first piece that you fell in love with of his and why?
This is a very interesting question and answer because I was a pop pianist until I went to college. I basically never heard classical music until I went to college. A random piece here and there. So I was really turned on to the Swingle Singers. Ever hear of the Swingle Singers, anybody? Ward Swingle started it. They won like 8 Grammy Awards. They were all like professional instrumentalists who took the music of Bach mostly Bach, but other composers, and instrumentals, Ted, sure, of course. And they sung it. So in other words, they take a fugue by Bach, a fugue like this. And they go boom, boom, dabba, 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 with a double bass pizzicato. And that really turned me on to Bach. You know, and then I showed that to my conducting teacher, who was a great harpsichordist and a purist, and he was appalled. But that's what turned me on to Bach, because Bach, you know, you can do that with Bach. Some of the pieces I first heard were Khachaturian's piano concerto. I heard when I was 16, completely bowled me over. And Mussorgsky, one of its operas. I mean, I saw, yeah, and Brahms. I heard one movement of Brahms' First Symphony in Shamokin, Pennsylvania, my Aunt Ruthie's house, when I was about 17. I was just startled. Actually, I went to a summer music camp when I was 16, in between my junior year and senior year, and that made me decide to major in music. But when I, came to Queens College, I didn't know any of the pieces that, on the listening list that you are required to listen to throughout the year. So it was a great learning experience for me. I had great teachers, great education at Queens College. Any other questions?
I guess not.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Harold. I really appreciate this, doing it for your hometown. And we are recording this presentation and we'll be putting it up on our YouTube channel.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed it.
Everyone have a good night.
Have a good night. Take care.
Bye-bye.